All right, so we are at Acts 5:17. But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is, the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in the public prison. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out, and said, "Go and stand in the temple, and speak to the people all the words of this life." And when they heard this, they entered the temple at daybreak and began to teach. So, anything grab you there? Or especially if you have a different translation. I'm interested in how the different translations tackle this one.
I wish it would happen like that now.
What grabbed me is if you have a purpose and God needs you to do something, even if you're locked in the prison,
Okay, sure.
you know,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right.
you know,
Yeah.
you're going to be let out and teach
Mm-hmm.
and spread the word of the Lord.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Yeah. The Lord's not going to let his plans be accomplished even by his own clerics. And
Yeah.
for that, I'm grateful. Because remember, the Sadducees are serving God in the temple, and he's not about to let that stop the work he wants to see done.
Yes. And also, they began to teach, even though they know the consequences.
Right. There you go. Mm-hmm.
But after being let out of jail by the angels, you'd have all kind of confidence, wouldn't you?
I
think things are.
Yeah,
yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah. Absolutely. I think. Go ahead.
I can't believe that the high, what is it, Sadducees
Uh-huh.
were jealousy.
Yeah, it flicks all kinds, including pastor types. A number of pastors I've heard confess to that in particular. That I heard a pastor. He's of a really big church. I mean, one of those massive metroplex kind of like looks like a giant cinema kind of places, and
Like those Joel Osteen kind of thing.
similar to that, like
Like
one of the big churches. You find them a lot more in the Midwest and down south, but yeah, a
Oh,
couple thousand people.
yeah.
And he was saying that was it Max Lucado came and preached, and he said they had 4 times the number of requests for the sermon they'd ever had on tape than when he had done it. And he couldn't help but feel incredibly like, man, I must not, he does that kind of professional, like, oh man, I must not be a good preacher kind of thing. So yeah,
Max Lucado has a lot of books.
he
Yeah.
does. Yeah,
What denomination is?
I don't know. I don't know at all. I'm sorry. Yeah. Anybody know it?
Well, does
South,
his
is he? Right, Max Lucado, where's he from?
I think he's Texas.
Texas.
I think
I
he's
think
Texas.
I think it's Texas.
That sounds about right.
Does books and stuff like that reflect what Lutherans believe?
They're more devotional in
Yeah,
tone. I would say they're not really doctrinal.
I've only read like maybe one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're
That's-
especially. I don't think they're especially crazy. I think they're just kind of. They're more like heart, encouragement, day to day kind of stuff.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I don't think they're. I don't think they're super.
More like an inspirational kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
inspirational,
Yeah.
All right, I wasn't sure if it was like.
They're not terrible. They're not terrible, but
Okay.
I think I
I have
have one.
one of
I
his-
didn't finish it.
I have one of his
I
books
have
at my house. It's still Rolling Stones or something
I
like
haven't
that. Or
read that
still
one. I
Moving
have one on
Stones.
here.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
I
I
didn't
have
read
a
that
study
one yet.
Bible too.
Oh, really? He did a study
Yeah.
Bible?
Wow.
Not really. It seems to me to be just like excerpts from a lot of his books.
Okay,
I
sure.
don't know if he actually wrote the
Got
study
it. Somebody
Bible,
collected it.
or if it was
Somebody collected it. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
publisher. I
Okay.
don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's not really like it didn't strike me as a study Bible. It was just like a story, I guess, like along the sides. So
Sure.
it wasn't terrible, but not as useful as something like this.
With those kind of study notes, huh?
Yeah, yeah. He wrote children's books
Oh, really?
too. Yeah, there's one I have for the kids about an acorn in a tree. That's pretty good. And he
Mm.
wrote like one bunch of characters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wembley's. I can't remember their names now, but they were a weird people. Cordelia's got one of the books, and she really likes it.
I have a note here from the previous verse.
Uh-huh.
It said that Luke includes women in the number of change from the early chapters. Women weren't virtually important.
That's true. In that day and age, it was absolutely true. Both in Roman society and in Jewish society in a different way. Now, Jews were much more important in Jewish society than they were in Roman society already. They had a it wasn't the same role, but they had a very significant role. One of the things I'm sure I'll teach about this in a sermon someday soon, but um, I almost dug into it when we had the Genesis text a couple weeks ago. The word that is used for helper in the in the Hebrew, excuse me, Jewish in the Hebrew, in Genesis 2, where God says, I will make a helper fit for him. We hear helper and we think tag along, but it's the same word applied to God when Israel needs a helper. So it doesn't carry with it any diminutive sense in the Hebrew. Really, the picture of Adam and Eve in Eden is side by side, not with any kind of distinction between them in terms of hierarchy. So, um, and that's why, as Paul, in my estimation, at least, this is why Paul, when he looks at who we are in Christ in Galatians, he'll say, in Christ there is neither, um, you know, Jew nor Gentile, and I'm probably getting the order wrong, but Jew or Gentile, slave nor free, man or woman, because we're back to equality. And we are every person in holy baptism equally connected to Jesus Christ and his death. So we're moving back in that does that mean that we're completely there yet? We're not in heaven yet. No, I get all that. There's hierarchies. The church has a hierarchy, right? I've got a supervisor above me. Each of us needs to. I mean, we just heard Jesus talking about, he refers to the centurion who talks about having people in authority under him. And what the centurion is saying is basically, you don't need to come because you've got authority for wherever you are. You can say it and it can happen, and that's why Jesus refers to his talking about that as faith. I haven't seen faith like this even in Israel. So it's not that there's no hierarchy. It's just that wasn't the original plan for humanity. And in Christ, that there's a restoration of that. Of what that prelapsarian is the theological term for before the fall, the prelapsarian state of man. So,
It says here too about when they were jealous about the
Mhm.
Sadducees being jealous. It says the Sadducees were jealous, not for God's honor or the advancement of His kingdom, but for retaining their own influence and power.
Clearly. Well, of course, you come right off of what's the paragraph right before that? There's healings and miracles, and people are bringing their people are coming in. People only come to the Sadducees for the annual sacrifices. They don't first of all come to them for advice.
Yeah.
That's what you go to your rabbi for, not your priest.
Mhm.
Um, and then and they likely don't have this kind of showing, even if they're offering something special.
Mhm.
One of the things I thought was interesting in the Chosen series was that when they introduced Nicodemus, now Nicodemus is a rabbi, he's not a Sadducee, but you do see him try to do an exorcism, and he fails. He tries to do an exorcism on Mary Magdalene, and it fails. So. Um, so I don't know how often Sadducees did things like exorcisms. We know that there's a whole branch of demonology that was already very current in the Judaism of Jesus's day. So there was an extensive understanding that there was a war going on between angels and demons, and that humans
Mhm.
got caught in the crossfire at least, and maybe had a role to play at times.
Oh yeah.
But so that wasn't a later development. That was an early development.
When did Nicodemus do this?
That's not in the Bible.
Oh, it's not
It's
in the
not in the
Bible.
Bible.
Okay.
It's not in the Bible. This is something they added fictionally because there would have been Jews doing exorcisms, but clearly Jesus is very good at it. So this would be that kind of professional jealousy thing, Oh, It worked for him. Why didn't it work for me?
Yeah, yeah,
Nobody's coming to hear me speak, and people aren't bringing people to me to be healed, and
yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Also, don't you think the Sadducees would have, to a certain extent, perhaps looked down on the apostles, almost like
Oh yeah,
ragtag group? Oh my
yeah,
goodness, they're
yeah,
not coming
yeah.
to
Paul
see
is
me.
Paul is trained. Fishermen are not.
Correct.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And they're not necessarily, in all likelihood, we don't have any. I've never seen a reference to Peter being of the tribe of Levi. Remember, if you're a Sadducee, you're of the Levitical tribe. You have to be of the right tribe to be. You're a priest by birth, by virtue of who you're related to, not by particular gifting, right? So they're the wrong people for God to be working through, right? Remember, the Levites are, when they come into the land, the Levites are the only tribe that get no land.
Mhm.
They're spread amongst all the other tribes, right? So, um, hey,
What? You're what? When they say in here, and maybe it's nothing, put them in the common prison. Is that? I mean, that's my translation.
yes,
Is the common prison
it's called yeah. I have
different
common
than?
prison, public prison. Presumably, yeah. Remember, there's a temple guard. That's the only armed. That's the only armed forces that the Jews have any control over. You know, um, my wife has her bagpipes over there for the all Europe wide festival the kids are doing with the homeschool group, right? She's got her bagpipes over there. Well, bagpipes were made illegal by the Brits. That's because they were an instrument of war.
Yeah.
That was how you called out commands on a battlefield. They didn't use trumpets in Scotland; they used bagpipes. So guys knew the tunes, and if they heard the right tune, it was flank right. It was whatever.
Oh, okay.
So they made all that. They made those things illegal. So that's where, especially if you in the 17 and 1800s, the Scottish music went underground, and a lot of that was kept alive with what were called chanters. Like they would do these little things. But it was tiny, and they would. A lot of the music became sung music. So music that had been played on a fiddle or pipes. Those all became what was called mouth music, push to beer. So they would sing. They put them into a rhythm, and they put sometimes nonsense words, complete idiotic words, just to get a rhythm to dance to, and stuff like this, because they weren't allowed to have their instruments. Oh, the same way the Jews were not allowed to have weapons. They were occupied. They weren't even citizens, right? As I was talking about in the lecture over there. Um, so what they would do is the only armed guards they had were allowed were the guards for the temple, so that people weren't coming in and trying to attack the temple for the treasures, because there was always stuff being offered at temple, right? But those were definitely not the same kind of not the same caliber of weapons by a long shot compared to what the Romans that were surrounding them had. They would easy for the Roman forces to overwhelm the temple forces, which is of course exactly what they do in 70 AD. They go and they sack the temple and destroy it, and all we have left is the Wailing Wall today, right? Um, so what we see here with the public prison, there was likely a prison just for Jews that would have been run by the temple guard. Putting them in the public prison puts them in with the common criminals who are also Roman citizens who had more rights than them. So you become the lowest of the low in the prison system there if you're in the common prison. Yeah. Good questions. What else? Anything else with this?
How did you become a Sadducee?
Well, the Sadducees ran the temple, so they were Levites, right? I don't know the whole of. I'm not a specialist in that part of Jewish history. You definitely came in and you served on turns, so you were drawn by lots. Most people only got to serve as priests one time in their lifetime. Okay, is to come in, but the Sadducees were kind of like the Sanhedrin. They were ranking, so there was a controlling group. So, like for instance, when Jesus was crucified, we know that Caiaphas is the high priest, and it tells us it was his year.
Okay.
So there would have been a different high priest if it had happened the year after. But Caiaphas was likely part of the core group of temple leadership all the time. These are the people who were very connected in the city with the occupying powers, the Jewish authorities. They were massaging everything.
So someone's intent to be a Sadducee would be
To
not,
be a
not like a
to be an influencer, at least, right?
Right, but it wouldn't be to serve. Wouldn't be like a pastor today.
No, not
You
at
know,
all.
like the
No, in
calling.
fact, yeah,
But their
priests.
want to be a Sadducee wasn't to worship God, right?
No, you're absolutely right about that. That's a great point. When we think about priests in the ancient world, don't think about pastors at all. Um, Someone who you'd tell your troubles to is not who a priest was in any culture. A priest, what makes a priest is that you offer sacrifice. So priests are the ones who know how to get rid of your troubles by telling you what you have to sacrifice to God. Okay. Now, in the pagan world, it was often a payoff because you wanted a favor. In the Jewish world, um, and this is hard for us to understand because we think of we tend to think because of where we are in history, we tend to think of like sin offerings as payments off to God. That's not at all what they were. Like the annual sin offerings, like Yom Kippur, which was the big festival of atonement, that was not for individual sins. It wasn't like you do this, here's what your substitute is for, here's how much you have to pay God to get forgiven for that. That's not the way the sin offerings worked at all. Okay. Sin offerings were so God could give you a gift. But Yom Kippur was for the sins of the people, which kind of I mean, one of my professors who had a good sense of humor, he used to say if there was a bumper sticker in the ancient world, it would read "Uncleanliness happens" if you were a good Jew. Um, that sin actually leaves a stain. It's not just guilt. We think of sin as like guilt, so it's like a mark against me. But if I sin in this room is tainted. Okay, this is why there was an offering of incense every night in the temple. The incense was literally to drive the sin out that had accumulated during the day. Okay, you were purifying the realm. One of the reasons why you had to really smoke it up is you had to smoke it up enough that you were getting the sin out. Okay, the offering to God was so God would purify the room. It wasn't a substitute like God, we sinned this much, please forgive us this much. It wasn't like that. And the reason why you really smoked it up on the Day of Atonement was that was the one day that the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. And you didn't, if God appeared, you didn't want him to see God because he would die. So it needed to be smoky enough you couldn't see across the room. Okay. Um, so this is why if you come to Vespers, I put a little incense in there so that when we sing "Let My Prayer Rise as Incense," you can see the smoke curling up. But it's really just for the visual. I'm not trying to smoke the room up. Our room has such a high ceiling; it would take a lot of smoke anyway.
Is that what David talks about in Psalms 51? How he wouldn't be
Yes.
pleased in burnt offerings? Is that the kind of burnt offerings
Yes.
you're talking
No,
about?
burnt offerings were the animals. The burnt offerings were the animals.
Okay.
Um, but you would have grain offerings and wine offerings and the incense offering. So that again, offering sacrifice. What did a priest do? He offered sacrifice. So the priest's job was to keep the temple rolling to offer the right sacrifices. If you were a pagan priest, it was to pay off the gods. If of it. So we as Christians, there was a kind of misunderstanding of Judaism, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, that said, well, Christians do what we do in response to a gift that God has given. Jews did what they did in order to please God. That's not at all the case. Um, the Judaism of the Second Temple period was not any more works based a religion than Christianity is. But the Pharisees were very focused on every jot and tittle of the law. And that's where Christianity became very different, where Jesus would in fact show people that the law was the law's fruition, its coming to full fruit, had wasn't about being legalistic and coming up with all these new laws to make sure you're following the first couple laws the right way. Its full fruition was a kind of freedom that we had to act as God's people. And that's what Jesus would point out in his teachings when he would say things like, "You've heard it said this, but I say this." What he was pointing out was not that the earlier saying was wrong; it's that it reached its fruition in a new way. And this is why Jesus would say, "I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." Right. So what else? grabs you as we look at this?
I was gonna say, as soon as they were um, released from the prison by the angels,
Okay.
they went right to the temple and started to preach. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big statement right